The winter rain had a way of softening the world until everything looked like a memory. It fell in steady curtains over the frontier town of Coldwater Ridge, turning dirt into sluggish rivers and rooftops into trembling drums. Lanterns flickered behind wavering glass, their glow struggling against the storm's relentless gray. In the center of it all, where the mud swallowed bootprints faster than they were made, a wooden platform rose like a bitter monument. Upon it stood Monty Whitlow, 26 years old, soaked through to the bone, her shawl clinging like a second, shivering skin. She held her spine stiff despite the cold, though her hands trembled in her sleeves like frightened birds. The people gathered below did not look at her the way they once had. Once she had been the rancher's daughter, the girl who rode across the plains with a braid flying behind her. Now she was simply opportunity to them, a chance for someone to claim labor, companionship, or gossip-worthy charity. The storm kept most decent folk inside, but those who came buttoned their coats tightly and kept their hopes shallow. Rain pooled in their hats, dripped from their beards and slid down their collars, yet their eyes remained sharp. Monty could feel them pressing into her like hands trying to reshape her. She breathed in deeply, though each inhale felt like swallowing winter. The scent of wet horses and soaked timber hung in the air. Behind her, Barton Creed, auctioneer, debt collector, and opportunist by profession and pleasure, rubbed his gloved hands together with a satisfaction she had come to despise. He stood beneath the tattered canopy, protected from rain the way she was not. His voice was eager already, eager to turn her life into coin and spectacle. Monty stared past the crowd, beyond the muddy street and shuddering saloon sign, to the mountains veiled in clouds. Somewhere in those vast ridges her parents rested, their graves marked by stones that no longer held fresh flowers. She had tried to keep the ranch afloat after her father's illness drained their savings, tried until her hands bled and her spirit frayed. But the debt stacked higher than she could climb, and Barton Creed, a friend when profit demanded, had swept in with rehearsed sympathy and a contract hidden beneath it. Now here she stood, repayment in human form. A whisper of bitterness rose inside her, yet she swallowed it down. She would not give Coldwater Ridge the satisfaction of watching her break. The murmurs below thickened as Clark Hensley pushed to the front. Clark, neat, charming, forever concerned with appearances, once walked her home under summer skies. But when the ranch began collapsing, he stepped back, speaking sweet words about timing and responsibility that tasted like cowardice. Now he studied her with a merchant's eye, weighing whether the woman he once claimed to care for was worth the price. His lips curled when he met her gaze, as though the rain had washed away the last thin film of shame from him. A hollowness opened in her chest. If he bid on her, it would not be kindness. It would be possession wrapped in polite language. Creed cleared his throat and stepped forward. His voice boomed over the rain, trained to rise above storms and conscience. Monty felt her pulse quicken. The world grew louder, the storm more vicious, the smell of mud more bitter. A tremor of panic threatened to crawl its way up her spine, but she clenched her jaw and willed her breath to stay steady. She would endure, the way she always had. Then, in the far corner of the street, a shape emerged from the rain. At first it seemed the storm itself had thickened, forming a tall shadow that moved with steady purpose. As it drew closer, the onlookers stiffened. Whispered fear rustled through the crowd. Even Clark's posture tightened. Monty followed their gaze and felt her breath catch. A giant of a man walked toward the platform, bare chest glistening with rainwater, muscles cut like stone beneath stormlight. His black hair, heavy with water, clung to his broad shoulders. Beads of rain slid along the scars mapping his skin, each one telling a story she could not yet name. Around his throat hung carved bone, worn smooth by years of weather and war. His expression was unreadable, neither threat nor comfort, yet his presence swallowed the space around him. An Apache warrior. A stranger to this town. A man who did not bow to judgment. He stopped several paces from the platform, rain pooling at his feet. His eyes, dark, steady, impossibly calm, rose to meet hers. It was not ownership in his gaze, nor pity. It was something she had not felt in far too long, recognition. As though he saw beyond her soaked shawl and trembling fingers to the part of her still fighting to stand. Monty's heartbeat shifted, not faster but deeper, like a drum adjusting its rhythm. Creed hesitated mid-sentence, thrown off by the warrior's sudden arrival. The crowd parted around the stranger the way water curls around a stone. Even the storm seemed quieter in his presence. She had heard tales of Apache fighters, fierce protectors of their homelands. But this man's stillness carried no boast. It was the quiet of someone who had endured storms fiercer than this one, and survived them without wavering. He did not speak. He only watched her, rain sliding from his jaw, breath slow and controlled. Mani should have felt fear. Instead, she felt her spine straighten, as though his gaze lent her borrowed strength. Clark cleared his throat loudly, trying to reclaim attention, but it fell flat. The stranger remained silent, yet he filled the air more completely than Clark's bravado ever could. Something inside Mani shifted, subtle but certain. She had arrived on the platform with the weight of defeat pressing her down. But under the steady watch of the giant warrior, that weight loosened just a fraction. Enough to draw a deeper breath. Enough to remember she was not powerless, even here. Creed lifted his voice again, preparing to begin the first bid. Mani braced herself, hands trembling once more. She expected Clark's voice to cut through the rain. Instead, in a deep resonant tone that rolled like distant thunder, the warrior finally spoke. His words were only four, but they struck through the storm and the crowd like a blade, altering the air around her. Do not sell her. And Mani, frozen in the winter rain, felt the world tilt. The words hung in the rain like an unexpected thunderclap, silencing every breath beneath the trembling canopy. Mani felt them echo inside her chest, vibrating through ribs already tight with dread. The Apache warrior stood motionless, but his presence seemed to bend the storm around him. Water slid down his bare shoulders in cold silver lines, catching what little lantern light fought through the downpour. No one moved. No one dared. Barton Creed blinked hard, as though clearing mud from his eyes. His gloved hand tightened around the edge of the platform rail. He forced a chuckle, thin and sharp. "This here's an auction," he said loudly, as if volume alone might chase away uncertainty. Not a discussion. But Mani could see the flicker of fear in him. Fear born not from the man himself, but from what he represented. The Apache were known in these parts, though mostly through rumors half twisted by fear and half by guilt. Yet the warrior before them showed no threat, only a strange, quiet conviction that unsettled every soul present. Clark Hensley took a small step closer to the platform, puffing out his chest, trying to reassert himself as the civilized center of the moment. Rain ran down his neat hair in miserable strands. "The man doesn't understand the law," Clark said, directing his words to the gathering crowd. "This woman owes debt. She will be sold. That's the order of things." But Mani watched the warrior, not Clark. The Apache's eyes did not rise to Clark, nor fall to Creed, nor shift to the murmuring crowd. They stayed on her. Dark, steady, patient. She felt stripped of every mask she had worn since her parents died. It was unnerving, yet something small inside her leaned forward rather than flinching away. Creed straightened his coat, snapping back into the role of a man whose profit depended on control. He lifted his ledger, voice hardening. "Begin the bidding at $20. Mani's pulse leapt. The words felt like shackles locking into place. She braced for Clark's voice. "20. Clark announced instantly. His tone was confident, claiming, almost victorious. The crowd murmured their approval. To them, this seemed the natural outcome. The respectable townsman rescuing the fallen woman. A story convenient enough to soothe consciences. Mani's stomach knotted. She imagined a future in Clark's home, a place where she would be talked over, corrected, tamed into something small enough to fit his fragile pride. She could already feel her breath shrinking in her chest. Creed nodded with satisfaction. 20 from Mr. Hensley. Do I hear? 30. The single word was a low current in the storm. Gasps broke from the crowd as heads whipped toward the warrior. Stone Hawk, she did not yet know his name, yet she felt it in her bones, stood as though he had merely spoken a truth, not a bid. He offered no further explanation, no challenge, only the number. A gentle assertion, not an ultimatum. Clark sputtered. "This is ridiculous. He's not even." 40, the warrior said, cutting him off without even looking in his direction. Clark's face flushed an ugly shade. You can't just, you don't. 50. The Apache's third number fell like a stone into deep water. Monty sensed the shift ripple through the crowd. Some stepped back. Others whispered. A few stared with something like awe. It was not the money that stunned them, but the man's unblinking certainty. He did not raise his voice, nor gesture, nor explain. He spoke like someone who had already measured the cost and accepted it. Creed swallowed thickly. He had not expected this kind of bidding, not in a storm this fierce, nor at an auction this ordinary. $50, he echoed. Going once. Clark shouted desperately. 55. His boots slipped in the mud, splattering his trousers. He did not care. Monty could hear the panic beneath his bravado. He wasn't bidding out of desire, but out of wounded pride. The Apache finally turned to look at him. It was not a glare or a warning. It was simply a long, silent look, ancient and unreadable. Clark's mouth snapped closed as though the weight of it pinned him still. Then the warrior turned back to Monty. 60. The number was soft. Almost tender. Her breath hitched. Not because she understood his intentions, she didn't. But because no one had ever fought for her, without asking for pieces of her soul in return. She felt exposed, suspended between fear and an unfamiliar warmth. Creed blinked rapidly. He knew better than to antagonize an Apache warrior. And $60 was more than the ranch land had fetched when it was seized. He raised his gavel halfway. 60 going once. But Clark wasn't finished. Rage twisted his features, dragging him into a reckless place. 70. A collective gasp. Monty felt her knees weaken. The number slammed into her like a cold wave. $70 meant ownership, not charity. Clark would not let her forget what she owed him. Before she could swallow the rising dread, the warrior stepped forward. The crowd parted automatically. Rain drummed against his shoulders with relentless force, but he didn't flinch. From the leather pouch strapped at his hip, he produced a thick roll wrapped in buckskin. He held it out, not to Creed, but open to the rain-soaked air. Inside lay silver coins, some old, some newly minted, enough to draw a stunned murmur from every throat. He spoke at last with intention, not simply numbers. No more bidding. The statement landed with a quiet authority that needed no force behind it. He placed the bundle on Creed's table. This is enough. Creed hesitated only long enough to confirm its worth, his eyes widening. The gavel fell with a trembling finality. Sold. The word struck Monty harder than she expected. She felt the world wobble beneath her, as though the storm itself shifted course. Sold. But to a man who hadn't once looked at her with hunger or judgment. Sold. But to someone who had spoken only truth in numbers, not claims of what she should become. Clark stood frozen, hands shaking with indignation. She belongs here, he hissed. The Apache offered no reply. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward Monty and nodded once. A gesture neither command nor request. A gesture of invitation. Creed motioned impatiently. Go on, girl. Monty's legs trembled as she stepped forward, descending the platform's slick steps. Each movement felt heavy, like walking through a dream too vivid to trust. The rain soaked her deeper, but the cold no longer cut the same way. She reached the warrior. His height towered above her, yet the space around him felt strangely warm. He slid his cloak from his shoulder, and draped it over her without touching her skin. The gesture was careful. Respectful. She looked up at him, searching his face for answers. For the first time, he spoke directly to her, voice a quiet rumble that braided itself with the rain. Come with me. You are safe. And somewhere deep inside her, something shifted like a locked door easing open. The rain followed them out of Coldwater Ridge like a long, aching breath. Monty walked beside the Apache warrior, his cloak wrapped around her shoulders, heavy with warmth and the scent of cedar smoke. The storm softened the edges of the world until the town behind them blurred into a smear of yellow lanterns and silent windows. Each step away felt like pulling loose from a tether she had not realized was strangling her. Yet with every mile, a new uncertainty bloomed beneath her ribs. The warrior did not rush her. His stride was unhurried, steady as a river carving its way through stone. Mani found herself matching his pace without thinking. He glanced at her only when she stumbled on a rock or slipped in the mud, his hand always hovering just close enough to catch her, yet never crossing the invisible line that protected her dignity. His silence was not the heavy kind that suffocates, but the kind that allows the world to breathe around it. Wind brushed cold fingers along Mani's cheeks. She drew the cloak tighter and tried to steady her trembling breath. She knew nothing of him, only that he had spoken for her when no one else dared challenge the cruelty of the moment. That kindness alone felt like a fire in the bleakness, but she remained wary. One good act did not automatically birth trust. She had learned that lesson through bruises no one saw. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally, her voice small beneath the roar of the rain. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, he watched the horizon, where the storm clouds churned like restless spirits. When he answered, his voice was low and steady. "A person is not meant to be sold." The simplicity of the statement struck her deeper than any elaborate explanation could have. She searched his face, but he offered no more. Mani let the words settle inside her like embers stirring after long cold. They reached the woods where towering pines shielded them from the worst of the storm. Needles glistened with raindrops, catching light in shards of silver. Mani followed him along a narrow path carved by years of footsteps, human and animal. Her boots squelched in the softened earth. The air smelled of wet bark and pine sap, a smell that eased something tight inside her chest. When they reached a clearing, she saw the cabin. It stood small and worn, leaning slightly to one side as though bowing to the forest's weight. Smoke curled faint from the chimney, barely clinging to the sky before the wind tugged it away. The windows glowed dimly like tired eyes. "This is yours?" she asked. "Yes." He pushed open the door. Warmth rolled out like a soft exhale. Mani stepped inside hesitantly. The interior was simple but cared for. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its flames licking the blackened stone. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. A wooden table carved with patterns she didn't recognize sat near the window, and a bed of furs lay pushed against the far wall. Everything smelled of smoke, earth, and something faintly sweet. Sage, she realized. He set his bough near the door, and began removing wet logs from a basket beside the hearth. Mani hovered near the threshold, unsure whether to sit or stand or thank him, or simply disappear into the shadows. "You are cold," he said without turning. "Sit near the fire." She obeyed because warmth called to her more than pride did. Kneeling by the flames, she let the heat lick her numb fingers. Steam rose from her soaked shawl. The cloak he'd given her still rested around her shoulders like a weight she didn't quite know how to carry. He moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency. Every action was deliberate, grounded, without wasted motion. He added wood to the fire, hung their wet outer layers near the flames, and set a pot of water to warm. His presence filled the small space without crowding it. Mani watched him in the flickering light. Rainwater clung to his hair, trailing down the long braid that hung over his shoulder. Scars patterned his back and arms, some small and thin, others deep and jagged. They hinted at battles she could not imagine, yet his movements were gentle, almost reverent as he worked. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, if you wish, you can go wherever you choose." She turned to him quickly. "You're not keeping me?" His brow lifted slightly, confusion flashing across his features. "No then, softer. Freedom is not a thing I take from others." The truth of it settled into Mani like warm sand. Relief washed through her so sharply she almost gasped. She had expected expectation, hunger, a price she would have to repay. Instead she found a man who guarded her space more fiercely than anyone she had ever known. She stared into the fire, letting its glow blur her eyes. "I don't know where I would go." "You do not need to decide tonight." His voice carried something she had not felt directed at her in years. Patience. Real, unhurried patience. The water began to bubble softly in the pot. He poured some into a small wooden cup and set dried leaves to steep within it. When he handed it to her, she noticed how he made sure their fingers didn't touch. The tea warmed her throat, and something in her chest loosened. After a long silence, she said, What should I call you? Sahatsoy, he answered. Then, after a small pause, Stone Hawk. She repeated the name quietly, tasting its unfamiliar shape. And you? Mani Whitlow. He nodded. Mani. The way he spoke her name, solid, unhurried, as though anchoring it to the quiet between them, sent a strange, soft shiver down her spine. The storm softened outside. Thunder retreated into the mountains, leaving only the whisper of rain filtering through branches. Mani's eyelids grew heavier with each passing minute, the exhaustion of the day finally weighing her down. Stone Hawk rose and fetched an extra fur from the bed, setting it near the hearth. Sleep, he said. The night will be cold. Where will you sleep? She asked. Outside. She looked up sharply. Why? You do not know me, he replied simply. Until you feel safe, the cabin is yours. Her breath caught. No man had ever given her more space than she asked for, let alone more than she dared hope for. The kindness in it struck deeper than any grand gesture. She watched him gather his bow, preparing to step into the cold night. Stone Hawk, she whispered before she could think. He paused at the door. Mani swallowed, unsure what she wanted to say. Only one truth rose to the surface. You don't have to stand in the rain for me. He turned slightly, firelight touching the edges of his profile. I have stood in storms far worse than this, he said softly. But I will not bring any storm inside with me. Then he stepped out into the night, leaving Mani in a cabin that suddenly felt too quiet, too warm, too full of questions she was not ready to name. She lay down near the fire, but sleep did not claim her quickly. For the first time in her life, safety felt like a puzzle. And as her eyes finally drifted closed, she wondered why a man who owed her nothing had guarded her freedom more fiercely than anyone who claimed to love her. Morning came shyly to the forest, brushing pale gold across the cabin walls and warming the thin veil of smoke drifting from the dying fire. Mani woke with her cheek pressed to the woven rug, her body sore but wrapped in a comfort she hadn't felt in months. She blinked at the soft embers, listening to the quiet rhythm of rain easing into a gentle drizzle. For the first time since she'd stood on that dreadful platform, she didn't wake with a knot of dread in her stomach. The cabin was empty, though. The door stood ajar, letting in a whisper of cold morning air. She pushed herself up, heart tightening unexpectedly at the stillness inside. Stone Hawk was nowhere in sight. She eased to her feet, wrapping the fur around her shoulders as she stepped outside. A faint mist hovered above the ground, each droplet catching the dim light. The scent of wet pine filled the space between breaths. She saw him near the treeline, already awake, kneeling beside a small pile of stones arranged with reverence. He moved with the quiet ceremony of someone greeting the earth itself. Mani hesitated, unsure whether to disturb him. But something inside her pulled forward, a thread tugging her gently toward him. She walked slowly, her footsteps soft on the damp ground. He heard her long before she reached him, though he didn't turn until she came to stand beside him. His eyes met hers with the same calm she'd felt last night, but she sensed something different beneath it now. Something heavier, as though he carried a truth he had chosen not to speak. You slept well? He asked. Yes, she said. Thanks to you. He nodded once, then stood. She followed him back toward the cabin, watching the way his shoulders shifted with each movement, steady, unhurried, as though he belonged to a different pace of living entirely. Inside, he rekindled the fire and set a small pot to warm. Mani noticed the careful way he moved around her, never brushing too close, yet always aware of her position, as though her comfort were a boundary etched in sacred ground. She found herself wanting to speak, wanting to fill the tender silence between them. But the right words were slippery things, hard to catch. He spared her the effort by speaking first. You may leave today if you decide, he said without looking up. The road to the ridge clears after the rain. The words hit her like a stone tossed into still water, breaking her thoughts into ripples. Leave. The option hung between them with too much weight. She swallowed, fingers tightening around the fur on her shoulders. And if I don't decide? She murmured. He paused, hand hovering over the pot. Then he lowered it gently and straightened. Then you may stay. Something in his voice made her look up sharply. There was no coaxing in those words, no plea. Just a quiet offering. But she sensed the restraint beneath them, the walls he held up so she wouldn't feel trapped. Those walls told her that he had learned the hard way how to keep distance, even when his heart leaned forward. She stepped closer to the fire, letting its warmth settle over her. "You slept outside," she said. "All night." He nodded. "Until the storm passed." "You didn't have to." "I did." His voice softened. A stranger should not wake in fear. She didn't understand the emotion that rose inside her, gratitude shaped like ache. She sat down on the floor, folding her hands in her lap. "I don't fear you." He studied her for a moment, as though testing the truth of her words. She held his gaze until he exhaled slowly, a sound almost like relief. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked softly, sending up sparks that danced in the warm air. Stone Hawk prepared their tea with steady hands, then handed her a cup. This time, she didn't hide the gratitude in her eyes. When they finished, he glanced toward the trees. His expression shifted, tightening slightly. Mani followed his gaze. A distant sound threaded through the quiet, a faint, rhythmic clatter. Hooves. More than one. Mani's breath hitched. The forest seemed to freeze, listening with them. Stone Hawk rose, his posture sharpening. "Stay inside," he said gently. Fear curled cold fingers around her spine. She recognized the voices drifting closer. Clark's sharp tone cut through the woods like a blade. Another voice followed, Sheriff Weller's deeper rumble. Panic flared in her chest. "They came for me," she whispered. Stone Hawk did not answer. His calm held, but it was the kind forged in the moments before a storm breaks. He stepped outside just as Clark and the sheriff emerged from the clearing, their horses snorting in the damp air. Clark's expression twisted when he saw her near the doorway. He jabbed a finger toward Stone Hawk. "There she is. You took her from town. You hid her." The sheriff shifted uneasily in his saddle. "We need to talk, son." Stone Hawk stood unmoving, tall and silent. Mani's pulse thundered in her ears. She stepped forward before she realized what she was doing. "I wasn't taken," she said quickly, voice trembling against the rising fear. "I came with him. Willingly." Clark let out a bitter laugh. "Don't lie for him, Mani. You think anyone will believe you left with an Apache by choice?" His words stung sharper than the cold wind. Shame and old wounds rushed forward, but Stone Hawk lifted a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to steady her. The gesture filled her with strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am not your concern," she said, turning to Clark fully. Her voice steadied, fueled by something fierce and new. "You lost the right to speak for me when you walked away." Clark flinched. The sheriff looked between them, uncertainty deepening. Stone Hawk stepped forward at last, his voice quiet but firm. "She is not held here. You may see that." Weller hesitated. "Then, it's her choice where she goes." Clark turned scarlet. "You can't be serious. She belongs." "She belongs nowhere she does not choose," Stone Hawk said softly. Mani's breath shook. Something deep inside her, something that had been locked behind fear and habit, finally shifted free. "I choose to stay," she said. Clark reeled back as though struck. "You're making a mistake." The sheriff sighed, tipping his hat. "If that's the case, I've no business interfering." Clark stared at her, something ugly twisting in his eyes, then yanked his reins and stormed off. The sheriff followed quietly. As the forest swallowed their departure, silence settled like a fragile blanket. Stone Hawk looked at Mani then, not with triumph, but with something far more tender. Something she wasn't ready to name, but felt like the beginning of a truth waiting just beyond reach. And in the hush that followed their departure, Mani realized what frightened her now wasn't the idea of leaving. It was the fear of what staying might mean. The forest held its breath long after Clark and the sheriff disappeared from sight, as though waiting to see whether Mani would run after them or crumble beneath the weight of her choice. But she remained where she stood, the damp earth cooling her bare feet, the echo of her own words still vibrating inside her. She had chosen to stay. The truth of it trembled through her like a new pulse learning its rhythm. Stone Hawk stood a few paces away, half turned toward the path, as if torn between going and remaining. The morning light brushed across his shoulders, softening the hard lines etched by years of survival. He looked carved out of silence and storms, yet unsure, for the first time since she met him. He bowed his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. "They will not return today," he murmured. "You have peace for now." "For now," she repeated, her voice soft, uncertain. The moment stretched taut between them. Birds began to stir in the branches above, shaking droplets from their wings. Monty rubbed her arms, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt, not from danger, but from the rawness of what she had declared. She stepped closer to him, drawn by a force she didn't have the strength to resist. "Did you think I would leave with them?" He hesitated. That rare uncertainty in him made her heart twist. "I hoped you would not," he said. "But hope can be a dangerous thing." The words struck her with a quiet ache. She studied him. How carefully he guarded the edges of his expression, how he spoke as though protecting her from something deeper within himself. She remembered the way he had stood outside the cabin in the storm, refusing warmth so she wouldn't feel threatened. She remembered the stillness in his gaze when he bought her freedom. All these gentle, voiceless truths had built toward this moment like stones in a riverbed. "I didn't stay out of fear," she said. "I stayed because—" But the rest tangled in her throat, raw and fragile. Stone Hawk turned fully toward her. Rain-soft light caught the angles of his face, the scar curving over his cheekbone, the quiet strength resting behind his eyes. "You do not owe me a reason," he said gently. "But I have one," she whispered. He took a single step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth rising from his skin. Her breath shivered as if the forest's air had thickened. He looked down at her with a softness she had never seen in a man whose life had been shaped by battle. That tenderness was more disarming than any weapon. "Say it when your spirit is ready," he murmured. "Not before." She closed her eyes briefly. One heartbeat, then two. "I don't want you to leave," she said. She opened her eyes to meet his, and something shifted in him, subtle as the opening of a door. But instead of stepping through, he turned away, tension rippling across his shoulders. He walked toward the cabin with slow, steady steps, as though containing something too large to let loose. When he reached the doorway, he said quietly, "Then I must leave." The words shattered through her. "Why?" she breathed, rushing after him. "Why would you leave now?" He faced her again, and this time the truth he carried was no longer hidden. It burned through him like a buried fire breaking the surface. "If I stay," he said, voice roughened by restraint, "I will not be able to hold my distance from you." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He continued, each word weighted and slow, as though he feared what would happen once they escaped. "I have tried to be careful. I have tried to give you peace. But when you stood for me today, when you chose to stay, I felt something inside me move, something I have kept locked away for years. I cannot stay near you and pretend I do not feel it." Monty's breath trembled, her world narrowing to the space between them. "What is it you feel?" she whispered, though her heart already knew. His jaw tightened, the conflict warring inside him visible in every line of his body. "If I speak it, I cannot take it back." "I don't want you to take it back." He looked at her then with a rawness she had never seen in him. A man stripped bare not by battle, but by truth. Slowly, as though surrendering to something he no longer wished to fight, he stepped toward her. The air around them warmed. The forest faded into a hush. "When I first saw you in the rain," he said, voice low and unsteady, "you looked like someone standing alone against the whole world. But you did not bow. You did not break. I saw your spirit before I knew your name. And each moment since, that spirit has drawn me to you." She felt tears burn, though none fell. He lifted his hand with exquisite care, pausing inches from her cheek. "I have loved you quietly," he said. "Loved you like a fire that warms from a distance. Loved you like a river that knows its way home but waits for the mountains to open." A soft sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a plea. She leaned into the space between them, letting the truth wrap around her like warmth after long cold. "Stone Hawk," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I stayed because being with you feels like breathing again. Like I'm not something to be claimed or rescued or shaped. I stayed because I feel safe in your silence. And I feel seen in your eyes." His breath faltered. For a long moment, he didn't move, as though afraid the world might break if he touched her. Then he lowered his forehead to hers, gently, reverently. His voice came out like a prayer shaped from smoke and longing. "Tell me to stay," he murmured. "I'm not telling you," she whispered back. "I'm asking you." He drew in a breath that shook him to his core. "Then I will stay." A thunderous crack echoed through the sky, sudden, sharp, splitting the quiet. Mani startled, clinging to him instinctively. But Stone Hawk didn't flinch. He stepped in front of her, protective in an instant, eyes narrowing toward the treeline. Another crack. Not thunder. Gunfire. Mani's heart seized as the forest erupted with echoing sound, violent and too close. And Stone Hawk whispered low, fierce and certain. "They have returned."